Hi, and welcome to the next video. In the last video, we left off at the point where we set up the entire notebook, added the OpenAI API keys, got the PDF, uploaded the PDF, read in the PDF, understood what tokens are, and then also chunked the tokens so that we are making separate calls to the LLM. We made then 10 chunks. We then wrote our first prompt using the prompt framework that we had discussed before, and we made the calls to the OpenAI API and got back the result or the highlights. And this is what you see here. So this is the podcast facts, and you can see it has followed the format and it has generated each and every highlight from that particular text and then put all of that in a new line. So you basically get all the highlights in a particular line, and this is what we are looking for. In this video, we go into the next steps to then generate the podcast script. So again, drawing a parallel back to the way a human being would do it, we have now performed the first step. So we have actually read the PDF and created a summary of it. And in the next step, we want to create a podcast script out of that based on the summary that we have created. Now, when you want to generate a podcast conversation, there are several ways that you can do it, right? And this is where the creativity of you as a human being and then the instructions that you give to the LLM kind of come into play. For instance, you can say, hey, start the conversation with some casual talk about what you're drinking, or, make some jokes at the start, or give each of the speakers a certain personality so that they have a certain mindset in the way the dialogues are generated and stuff like this. I would encourage you to play around a lot with this. This is really the most creative aspects of working with LLMs, and I have seen previous learners come up with such interesting ways in which to make that podcast appealing to them, because you can also lend your own persona to it, right? So you can say, hey, I have experience in this, so I already know a lot of that, and so based on this, please generate the podcast dialogue the way I would do it or the way you would do it, right? So this is where your creativity really can shine. I provide you with some hints, and we will look at why these hints are necessary as we go through it. But let's actually get to the prompt itself, right? So what we're trying to do here is we wanted to generate the podcast transcript or the podcast script based on the highlights that we have set, right? So I also have here learner tasks. You don't necessarily need to create only one style of podcast. You can have different styles of podcast and so on. So there's really a lot that you can play around with. But I would again encourage you to play around and use the same prompt framework that we spoke about earlier, and then use this to come up with several ways that you can do it, right? In my case, I already created a podcast style or a podcast prompt, so I'm just going to copy that here, and this is kind of what I came up with. So I said, hey, could you simulate a podcast conversation between Sid and Darren having a conversation about the following facts, right? So these are the facts or the highlights that we have generated before. So it can be facts, it can be highlights, however you want to talk about it. And this is kind of how I'm doing it. And then I'm giving it very specific instructions. So I say, hey, some things I'd like to ask. And again, this is where prompt engineering kind of comes into play. You could say, you must follow the following instructions, right? So this is kind of saying, hey, do not just please, that's not good to have, you must do this. Saying use Sid and the colon as well as Darren and the colon to indicate who is speaking, because you want to have actually the dialogue for each person there. So in this case, I am trying to have it, frame it as a conversation between two people, because I think this is what makes podcast interesting. Then I say start the dialogue with a casual discussion on what each person is drinking right now. You could also say, hey, start the podcast with a nice joke or something like that. Then I say make the dialogue about this as long as possible and make it sound funny, right? I am trying to add a bit of humor. I want to make this entertaining. It can be a bit boring, but maybe that's not what you want to do, because you're talking about a research paper and you want it to be scientific. Then I also try to lend some personality. I say, hey, Sid is the one presenting the information, and Darren is asking intelligent questions that helps Sid elaborate the facts, right? So you're kind of saying, hey, one person talks about something, the other person is asking questions, so that together they are learning it. You can also change this up to say, hey, Sid is the one who does not have any information about this particular topic, and Darren is the one explaining it patiently. So this is again another way for you to understand, let's say, a research paper or a more complex topic. And please provide only the podcast dialogue and no further information. And this is something that I had to add based on, as I experimented with it, it comes up with a lot of artifacts. For instance, it might say, oh, I'm so happy to create the podcast dialogue for you, and then actually give the entire podcast dialogue. And I'm not interested in this first line, because then it prevents me from further processing this and generate the actual audio from it. So you will learn this as you play around with it, which is why I encourage you to kind of play around with it, test it through the entire notebook, and then you will learn where it works, where it doesn't work, and what are the kind of prompt techniques that you should be following. But this is sort of my podcast prompt. So this is an example that I am doing or trying to deal with here. And so what I'm doing is you can of course add your different styles. There are some examples of this as well later on, which you can take as inspiration. But for now, let's just focus and do only the first style. So I say here, this is my request message. This is the message I'm sending to the LLM. I take in the first broadcast style prompt. So this is the one that I just created, and add the podcast facts, which you had before, right? So this is what you generated before. So you're just piping that in to this, and then going to create this. So this is what your entire prompt now looks like. So you have the first prompt, which is where you've provided all the information, and then you have all the highlights that you got before. So that's the thing that you have done. And now you're making the call to, again, GPT-4o Mini. You give the same system prompt, because again, you're making a single call. You're not treating this as a conversation, and your actual prompt and instructions are in the user message. So that's what you see here. Another interesting variable now that you see I've introduced here is this temperature, right? We spoke a lot about temperature in the earlier videos where we were talking about token traversal and so on. I just experimented by adding a temperature value of 0.2 to give it a bit more randomness, to kind of take it in a bit more creative direction. You can actually play around with this and say, give it a temperature of 1.2, and then you will observe the kind of responses that you get back, which could be and typically are very, very far away from the topic that you're discussing. So it might get too funny and things like that. So that's kind of what you should experiment with and learn. But let's actually take a look at what this podcast script looks like. So you can see here, this is kind of what it gave me. You can see, first of all, that there is a Sid and a Darren. So it followed the instruction by saying, hey, prefix every dialogue with the person who's speaking it. We will see in the next step why this is important. Then it says every dialogue is in a new step. So, it is a new line that you can see. And it also starts with, hey, what are you sipping on today? Just a classic iced coffee, and then fancy herbal tea, supposed to be calming, as it makes me jittery about apples. And so you can see there's a bit of this humor, or, trying to make it a bit funny and stuff like that. So, and then you can see, that there's really a lot of dialogue. So you can say, you can't leave unless you're wearing our exclusive sneakers, and stuff like this. So they're trying to make it a bit funny, but also still explaining the highlights that we had before. So it's actually getting the information specifically for Apple from the information that we have provided, which comes from the PDF, right? So they've got this dominant position in the smartphone market, which lets them impose these ridiculous fees. So this is all stuff that we have seen in the PDF, and it's coming from the Department of Justice and so on, right? So this is how it has sort of done the whole thing and generated all of this podcast dialogue, right? So I would say this is pretty cool. It already works quite well, and now you can try to lend a personality to each speaker, try and have multiple speakers, maybe like a group discussion. It depends a lot on the PDF that you're using, on what you're trying to kind of learn and so on. So that's really where the creativity comes in. So we've generated the podcast script. The next step is to generate the podcast audio, and that's also easily done by still continuing to use the OpenAI API. This is something that they introduced in November 2023, which allows you to make use of the API to also generate voices as well. And you can take a look at this. If you Google the OpenAI voice movement, so for instance, you can say OpenAI voice API. So this is what will take you to the text-to-speech aspect of the OpenAI platform. And then this is the one, and you can see this is an example of an alloy voice, and you can go here. You can see the speech endpoint. This is the alloy one, but you can also see, yeah, here are the voice options. They have like 6 or 7 options. You can play which one, yeah, is appealing to you, and then according to that, choose that in the code that we are making, right? So I also talk a bit about another option. So OpenAI is not the only way to lend a voice to your script. You can also use Levin Labs, which is actually even better. They have a lot more variety in voices and stuff like this. But I have specified this in the extensions part of the notebook. So yeah, you can take a look at it there. I have provided some helper functions in order to help you generate this. This is important because what these functions are doing is, so this particular one, for instance, is making a call to the OpenAI API and using this particular model, which is the text-to-speech model, and also takes in the input text and the speaker voice. This is the actual helper function, where all we are doing is taking the podcast script, parsing through it in a line-by-line fashion, extracting the name of the speaker, and also then lending or determining which speaker gets which voice, right? So this is just a kind of solution to help you parse the script that comes out. And this is important because this is kind of how I choose to do it. And that's why it's important to make sure that you take care of these things, like the fact that every new dialogue is on a new line, every dialogue or every line has the corresponding speaker associated with it, because this is how you need to parse through it to then call the OpenAI API voice library. So what is the learner task then? The learner task is to actually specify which voice you would like for each speaker. You also need to specify the speaker name and so on. So for instance, now in this case, I'm going to say Sid. This is the first speaker. Here, maybe I choose to go with Aloy. That's the name of the speaker that I want. The second speaker in my case is Darren. And here I go with a speaker choice called Fable, right? So these are from the API that I just showed. When you then run this file, this might take a bit longer. The text-to-speech API is a lot less, so it takes a lot more time in order to generate the podcast, make the API call and stuff like this, as compared to the LLM and so on. So this might take a bit of a while for you to process. So let's just give it a few seconds.